also present in some form in other religions, or is it just specific to this Hinduism?
Yeah, that's what I was telling yesterday when Arjun was asked this question, that this documentary to you. I don't know how to show it, but yeah, maybe I'll send the link and you can watch it on your own, which is a compulsory documentary. But to answer your question, a caste passed on Hinduism, Brahminical Hinduism, to other religions in India. Okay, and it is very much a part of, in certain ways, not as much as it is in terms of Hindu religion or Brahminism, but it is as much a part of Christianity, Sikhism, and even Islam in many parts of India, because when people converted to or when people converted to Islam or within Sikhism for that matter, many times what happened is the caste was not forgotten. Okay, so in that sense, within different religions in India, caste exists. Those religions by themselves did not have something like caste, but because of the, this is what is cultural, this is how culture affects each other, and therefore we need to understand culture and food habits and clothing and many things for that matter related to any society a little more critically, because maybe it is not an imposition, but sometimes it is acculturation. There's a term called acculturation where different cultures meet each other because of various reasons and therefore get influenced and take on positive and negative aspects of it, and thus acculturation happens and a new culture develops. So change is a must in culture, and within caste, therefore, also different religions in India also have some form or the other forms of caste, because when people converted, their caste was not forgotten really. If you look at southern India, there are many places where caste of the when upper caste and lower caste both converted. One of the benefits that the lower caste received is that they were allowed access to education. They were allowed to have their own churches, unlike in Hinduism where they were not allowed into temples, etc. But what remained is that the upper caste converts did not want to accept the lower caste converts in similar ways. Therefore, in many southern Indian places, you will find different churches for the upper caste and different churches for the lower caste. Similarly, in Islam, also, many times when people converted to Islam, the lower caste who were converted to Islam were not treated as hierarchically similar or in a similar status by the upper caste who converted to Islam. So this is a little complex. Caste influence India, and in many ways, caste is present there also. And this documentary that I want you to watch will make it much more clear. But the thing is that it was in contact with, and I'll give an example to you. In terms of, suppose in Kerala, the Syrian Christians are generally the upper castes who converted to Christianity. Okay, the other Christians who lower castes who converted to Christianity. Interestingly, in terms of marriages, if Syrian Christian children kind of fall in love with or want to marry Nambudiri Brahmin or Nair community men or women, Syrian Christian families will be much more open to that compared to those very children wanting to marry Dalit Christians there, lower caste Christians there. Okay, this is how caste operates. Syrian Christians, despite many Syrian Christians, despite the fact that their ancestors they converted from Hinduism to Christianity, because they converted from upper caste to Christianity, they still do not accept the lower castes as equally, lower caste converted Christians as equals in Christianity. This is an example of it. So how caste operates, that you are ready to marry your children outside religion, but not outside your caste. And if you're interested in reading novels, I think one of the best novels that has been written about caste and especially in the context of Kerala and how religion, even Christianity is impacted by caste in a large way. Okay, you should read The God of Small Things. It's a wonderfully written. Arundhati Roy is a god of small things. It's a wonderfully written book novel, bringing out the subtleties of how caste goes beyond conversion and kind of impacts Kerala society. So yeah, caste does affect religion, and different religions in India do follow certain kinds of caste because conversion happened from different groups. But when I'm saying this, I also want to tell something because some of you may misunderstand it or may not understand me rightly. I am not saying that conversion did not do anything for the lower caste. I am just saying that caste continued to be a matter for them which discriminated them and kept them hierarchically low in many contexts. But I'm not nowhere saying that conversion is wrong or conversion so it did not benefit the lower caste because it did benefit the lower caste in so many ways, like having their own places of prayer, like not having kind of like having access to literacy, okay, and like kind of also in certain ways after conversion the discrimination of physical contact etc did not remain in many ways. So in many ways conversion did give spaces to the lower castes and all, but that did not necessarily mean erasure of caste. That's what I want to say. Is it okay, Roshan?
Yeah, and one more thing, given that caste doesn't really have a basis based on scripture in, say, Christianity, for instance, uh, do
Mhm.
you think that over generations it could like vanish and they could become casteless in a way of speaking?
I don't know if only mere conversion to Christianity would banish it altogether because that is the power of caste in India. That is how rooted we are in caste. Despite the fact, I'll come to a topic called castelessness, the claim to castelessness, and who can claim to be casteless. That who can tell that we are not caste people. The people who are doing reservation politics are caste people, casteist people. Who has the who has the privilege to claim casteness? I'll come to that in detail, but just to answer your question in a simple way, is that I do not believe, and studies and history doesn't show that because the scriptures do not talk about caste discrimination or any such discrimination based on any religious scriptures, etc., doesn't mean that caste will vanish because caste is very rooted, and for caste we have to take a different approach altogether. And that is why I was talking about annihilation of caste to read about it, because then we have to question the very basis of what is Brahmanism, because it is so strong. And for generations, can you imagine people converted during the colonial times and missionary times? Forget colonial times. Missionaries came before colonizers during that time, but still caste exists in those societies because caste is so rooted, and because the largest Indian society is caste society, it is not easy to be rooted and thrown out of it. So I don't see that scriptures and Christianity or Islam do not really do not actually accept such discrimination that will lead to anything with generations. Is the questioning of caste in a larger society that will only lead to changes even within other religions, for that matter. But maybe, I mean, I should be, because you asked this question, maybe I should be looking at other texts because there is a lot, very less studies in terms of caste in other religions. Okay. Only in the last 20 years, I think 15, 20 years, people have started looking at it as such. But maybe I should look for things if there are any kind of changes that can this kind of, because now what is happening even religions are becoming more and more absolute. Within religions in India, there was so much difference. A Kerala Muslim will not identify with a Northeast Muslim in terms of language, in terms of food habits, in terms of culture, marriage, and many things. Okay, or a Calcutta Muslim or a Calcutta Christian may have nothing in common with a Tamil Muslim or a Tamil, nothing as such except Quran or Sharia or something. But within that, Sharia also was very different. Different laws locally were influenced. So, but today, in this globalized and whatever is called as the anti-terrorism societies and campaigns, religions are also becoming more and more absolute. They're also trying to become more and more like one monogamous religion types. So within that, I'm not sure if there are any call for removing caste because scriptures do not produce it, because scriptures do not say justify it in their own religions. It's a very good question. I think I'll keep this in mind, and I will there are any studies related to it, because that may happen also, that because you want to become a pure religion, you want to erase caste. Maybe I'll just find out. That's very nice. Thank you, Saroshan. Yeah. Meghala is asking, ma'am, which one has more population, upper caste or lower caste? Also has this, also how this ration changed over the time. Okay, ratio changed over this time. Upper caste definitely a lower in population than compared to the middle caste and the lower caste. That I know very well. That is why the whole debate that, how is a minority controlling such a majority? What is the political economy of it? And how does, that is why we are doing characteristics of caste, and how political, a very few minority are and those five minority for forever and ever have kind of dominated the resources, have kept the resources to themselves. Okay, when they are claiming that, we are the hardworking people, who actually were the hardworking people whose labor has made this country. Okay, and so that way, yes, to answer your question, the population wise upper caste are lower than the middle caste, and if you compare the backward caste and the lower Dalits, the upper castes are the lower in number in terms of it, and this ratio cannot change as such, because, in general in population it has not changed. It is still that the middle caste and the lower caste are more in population, and therefore when I'm coming to post-colonial India, that is post-independent India, I will explain to you that when the OBC reservation was demanded and given, why were the upper castes so outraged? Because they suddenly knew that this, and also when in Gandhi and Ambedkar, I don't know in an online class I can go into that debate or not, because it follows certain kind of, I teach in a certain way where I land up with Gandhi and Ambedkar and the Pune Pact, where Gandhi refused to accept the Pune Pact, because if Pune Pact was accepted, it would have been so obvious that the Brahmins were a minority or the upper caste were a minority but controlled the majority of Hindus. Okay, so that is a politics of Pune Pact in some ways, and that is why Gandhi went on fast and did not want to give separate electorate to the Dalits and the middle caste, okay, into the Dalits, and then when Ambedkar was asking for it, okay, because it will be so obvious then that Brahmins were and upper caste were so minority in number. But if you come to OBC reservation Mandal Commission was actually a very, very big kind of drawback for the upper caste Brahmins and other Kshatriyas and others who were claiming to be who were the ritually highest caste, because suddenly they were not large in number, because there was not just Dalits but also SCs and SCs, but also the middle caste was breaking away and telling that we never belonged to your caste. You never gave us the rights that you enjoyed or the resources that you had, and therefore we need justice and reparation. So in that sense, yes, upper castes were minorities compared to the middle and the lower castes. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, if you have no questions, I will get into what I was doing last time. And I'll just give a recap of what I was doing and why I was doing it, and then I will go over to give you examples of certain societies, certain ways of how caste economy was maintained through endogamy and different kinds of, or for that matter, exogamy, with wherever it was privileged. And then I will go to colonial India and I've sent you a note. If you look at it, I will go to the idea of caste class continuum. And now that we are doing traditional societies, what happened in the colonial times? How did caste change? And did the change in castes, ways of living, kind of, wait, I'll close the door. Just a minute. Yeah. How did changes in caste system actually, did the changes in caste system during colonial times actually lead to a break in a kind of annihilation of caste, or did it lead and new forms of class emerged, or is it that caste continued to be class? So, like yesterday, I was talking about endogamy, okay, and I was saying that endogamy is marriage within the caste. Okay, you are not allowed to marry with outside the caste. And I was also saying that arguing that, and when I'm saying I am arguing, I'm arguing from studies and scholars, and not just my own personal view. So when I was trying to say that, in terms of endogamy, marriage is essentially within the caste, and you cannot go with outside the caste. So marriage within the caste is called endogamy. Now, why is it important for us to understand? It is important for us to understand because the economics of caste was maintained through endogamy, because intermarriages would lead to breakage in transfer of property in the caste line. Okay, so if you start marrying each other in different castes, etc., then the properties also get transferred here and there, and the caste property doesn't remain intact. And therefore endogamy is I explained it this last class, so I'm not going into detail of it. Therefore endogamy becomes a tool of maintenance of caste. Okay, therefore this whole ritualistic notion of marriage, that it's just about marriage and has nothing to do with economics, is not true, because marriage ensured that caste wealth and property remained within the caste. Okay, and therefore any breaking of any resistance to endogamy as a rule in caste was kind of dealt with discrimination, with violence and discrimination, largely violence and murder. And I was giving you example of honor killing. Okay, how the honor of the caste became more important than the lives of the members of the family of the caste, and therefore, especially when an upper caste woman marries a caste lower than her, or especially untouchable caste, how violence unfolds not only on the woman and the man, but on the family of the man and the community of the man. So, in that sense, I was trying to say that endogamy matters. Endogamy matters in terms of the economics of caste, and not necessarily is only a ritualistic thing. So in terms of, and I was talking about how, then I was trying to say the intersections, if you remember intersectionality that we had discussed, the intersections of caste and gender plays out within caste, whereby women become the holders of honor of a family and a community and caste. So the burden of keeping the community and the caste intact lay on women, and therefore upper caste women were relegated to the private spaces and not allowed access to the public spaces as such. Okay, and within even when they were allowed to go to the public spaces, like sometimes to agricultural fields, or to collect certain kind of things or whatever it is, it was done, and or it was allowed within the boundaries of what is called as an honorable or a good woman. So what you have to understand is that gender and caste intersect with each other, crisscross with each other, and create different kinds of privileges and marginalization for different kinds of women. When I'm saying privileges and marginalization, I'm trying to say that caste is a privilege for some, caste is underprivileged for others. The people who were ritually higher in caste and had economics of caste in their side, for them caste became a privilege because it was due to caste norms, caste values, and caste rules and regulations that they were rich, they were protected, they had political and economic power and ritual power. It was not their labor or not their intelligence, not anything that they have achieved, but was given to them. So caste became a privilege for them. Whereas, because people were born into certain kinds of castes, and caste norms and values and rules did not allow them to do certain kinds of jobs, etc., their labor was used, but they did not gain anything from that. So caste became an underprivileged, a source of marginalization for them. And not only that, violence against any kind of questioning against this kind of norms by these communities, caste that violence, discrimination, and segregation became tools of caste to maintain caste. So the movement, if because economic and political power not having it did not allow these groups to question caste, but we remain subordinated. But when they questioned, there was violence, not just violence, political violence, but ritually sanctioned violence, whereby the lower caste remained subordinate and were made to remain subordinate. When it comes, this is about lower caste and upper caste in general. Within that, if you look at intersections, and remember when I discussed intersectionality, you will understand that gender and caste intersected with each other, overlapped with each other, crisscrossed with each other to create a different set of privileges and underprivileges for women within the castes. I'll explain it a little more. So women from upper caste, who were the propertied class, who were the class which could own and property and had wealth and property, landed castes. How did caste matter and gender come crisscross with each other and matter to their life chances and lifestyle? Because within these are propertied classes, the inheritance has to be in pure line, and therefore upper caste women's sexuality was controlled. Therefore, they were relegated to the private spaces. Therefore, they were not allowed to be literate, to go out and work. Their mobility was controlled, their sexuality was controlled. Who will they marry? What kind of relations they will have? Where can they go out? Who can see them? Who they can see, etc., etc., etc. Their characters, their sexuality, everything became so important because it was not for their protection but the protection of the larger property of the family and the caste. Okay, their sexuality, the reproductive line had to be ensured within the caste, and therefore their sexuality and control over their sexuality was very, very important. And therefore, what do you do to control somebody, to keep somebody subordinated? You deprive them of economic opportunities, one. Okay, and you socialize them that this is what you are meant to be doing by birth, and that is where your gender comes in. So two factors. Okay, the restrictions on their mobility, sexuality, education, overall life chances. What did it do to them? If you don't allow somebody to read, write, and do employment, if you and caste do not allow property to be owned by women, okay, so in that sense, if you are not owning property, you do not have a job, you don't know how to read and write, and therefore your chances of doing any kind of employment, you are not taught any skills other than cooking and cleaning and maintaining household as such. What are your opportunities in life? Your opportunities are almost next to zero, right? And why is it so important in caste and gender? It is important, caste and gender, is that you remove all chances of any form of questioning, because if you empower women economically, educationally, in terms of wealth and property, in terms of political power, they will question. And therefore caste system ensured that not only they are controlled, their sexuality is controlled, but they are deprived of any kind of ownership of wealth and education and job and employment, so that they remain subordinated and never question even if they broke their socialization, if they broke the hegemonic ways of dominant ways of thinking and felt and wanted to question, they can never question it. And if questioned, then there is a lot of violence waiting for them to put them in place, from domestic violence to sexual assault to being thrown out of the house and abandoned, to many, many things, to witch hunting, to kind of, I'll come more in gender class. So, what I'm trying to say here is that through caste norms, intersections of gender and caste saw to it that women's sexualities were controlled. Upper caste women's sexuality was controlled because they belonged to propertied class. They were, if you know this term, private public private divide. Okay, the false public private divide. Okay, like we say that family is a private matter, nobody should interfere. What is this public private divide? Within this public private divide, upper caste women were relegated to the private spheres. Okay, they were put inside as good women, the housebound women, the women who never crossed the boundaries of the house and family and community. Okay, the honorable women. So you basically put them on a pedestal and say that if you are like this, you will be a good woman and more wanted, and therefore make them follow patriarchal caste norms, Brahminical caste norms, so that at the end of it, what is ensured, it is ensured that they do not cross the boundaries of community and family, and therefore your lineage is secure. Okay, so in that sense, any violation of the purity of these women from outside. When did domestic violence become a crime in India? 2005. Okay, before that, domestic violence was not a crime in India unless dowry was attached to it. It was in 1983 that the serious dowry law, the 82, 83 serious dowry law came in India. So when I am not getting more details into it, I'm just giving you as an example because what kind of violence was seen as wrong and what kind of violence was not seen as violence when it came to caste and gender is that any violation of the purity of this woman, upper caste women, from outside, okay, outside marriage, outside family, outside caste becomes a violence. Violence within the marriage, violence within family, violence within community doesn't remain as violence in within the caste norms, and thus there was justified punishment waiting for people who violated these caste boundaries. But within the caste, the violence that was intra-caste violence that was happening on women was seen as honorable, as seen as control over one's family and women, as seen as a matter of pride. Okay, so therefore, honor killing is justified, whereas marrying outside the community is not seen as justified. Okay, so given the economic dependence of women on their men, they accepted this subservient status. So now you understand how caste is a privilege for upper caste women, whereas also a marginalization for upper caste women. In one sense, they are protected from being violated by outsiders. Okay, they are given proper, they are taken care of, food, clothing, etc., as long as they are good women, honorable women. They're following the tradition. Within that also violence happened, but nobody wanted to recognize it. On the other hand, who were the public women? Who were seen as dishonorable, no honor attached to them, not good women, no character, characterless women, etc. The women who went outside to work, the women who were in the public sphere. Now, who were forced to be in the public sphere through caste norm and also because of their economic conditions. It was the lower caste women who went out to work, not just because caste did not allow them for economic conditions to be better off, but also caste forced them to come out of their homes and give their labor both in agricultural field and within the homes of the upper caste and the middle caste. So in that sense, these castes were not property classes, so there was no threat to a inheritance in terms of a pure line. Okay, one. Second, the economic and caste norms kind of forced them to go out to work and leave whatever is called as the private familial spaces. And once they left the private familial spaces, seen as public women, it was any form of sexual assault, sexual exploitations, etc., by upper caste men was a routine affair, and they could never question it because it will lead to not just violence against them but also against their family and community. So, lower caste women were underprivileged in two different ways. They were not protected as good women, honorable women, etc., because they were not property class women. Okay, in a way, it was freedom for them because they could go out, explore their sexualities in certain ways, etc. But their sexualities were not protected because upper caste men thought that they didn't that caste allowed them to kind of not just own their labor but also their sexuality, and that therefore they were expected to provide not just kind of physical labor but also sexual labor to the thing. And I gave you examples yesterday of many ways in which kothas and dance Devdasis, etc. So you read about Devdasi system and all, and you will find out the many different ways in which lower caste women were exploited sexually, and sexual assault was a very common thing against them. Even when their men did something or questioned or resisted the violence may also fall on the woman, including sexual violence on them, as a matter of revenge, as a matter of punishment to them to their men, and it continues even today in many places. You just have to read on, and then you saw what happened in recently, and just before Nirbhaya became a big story, but just before that, two lower caste women, girls, were raped and gang raped and hanged on in the village street with, I mean, near in the agricultural field in a tree, and no and this is such a routine affair in many parts of India that it goes unnoticed because the belief is that they are not honorable, good women, and they are public women, and therefore their sexuality is not something of concern for the larger society. So caste kind of intersects with gender, and therefore lower caste women suffer much more than upper caste women in terms of a double burden of sexual assault as well as labor exploitation and other forms of things. So, just to wrap up what I was trying to say in terms of caste and sexuality, caste and gender, if there is a public and private divide, the question is who could kind of move between the public and the private, and who could not move between the public and the private. If you look at upper caste men in endogamy, they would marry within their caste, but their sexual explorations, okay, or their sexual life did not necessarily. I'm not saying all upper caste men did this, but the rest caste as a norm and caste as a system did not restrict their sexuality to the private spaces of marriage and family. They would do endogamous marriages and follow caste norms and give birth to children in the caste line, etc., but would have access to other spaces, other legally established, caste established spaces of kothas and dance girls and devdasis and other kinds of forms, including sexual violence of lower caste women, and therefore could move between the private and the public from endogamous relationships to exogamous relationships without any hassles. Okay? Whereas upper caste women were confined within endogamous relationships, and any form of breaking of this led to violence, including murder and honor killings, which is called as honor killings. So you have to understand the hypocrisy of caste and endogamy in that. And the children produced out of this license that upper caste men had with lower caste women, Devdasis and others, were not accepted as legitimate children and were not given the right to property or maintenance or anything like that. Okay. In some ways, Devdasi systems, Kotha systems got kind of patronage from the upper caste men who visited these places and under whose landlordship or kingship or whatever it is, they were there. Their children received money from their father and kind of not that the money received from such kind of sexual labor maintained their children, etc. The colonial system completely broke this system of support of these lower caste women and forced them into street prostitution. That's a long story. I'm not getting to it. That is what colonial law did to lower caste women who actually had some kind of, it was not a, it was a very exploitative system within caste. It was a very a violent system within caste, but it still some gave them some kind of economic security within caste. Whereas colonial rulers who thought that they are civilizing our society and bringing better system and kind of freeing the lower caste women from kind of devdasi systems and dance kothas etc., actually did nothing for them but broke the only system of support that was there, and they were forced into street prostitutions and other forms of sex work. That's a long story. I just wanted to give you this idea. Many of them landed in Tamil movie industries, etc. Okay, for as dancing girls and all, because that time upper caste women would not learn dancing, would not go, who were not allowed to learn dancing, would not be allowed to perform outside, would not kind of be allowed to kind of be a part of movie industries. So it was these dance girls, kothawalis, all of these people who devdasis, who actually were performers and artists and singers and dancers. These were the people who lost their patronage through colonial intervention and landed up in streets or in film industries or in other spaces of exploitation. So this is another part of the story. I'm not getting into it. All you have to understand here is that caste created norms within which endogamy was a necessity to maintenance of the economics and wealth of caste, whereas it also left women, upper caste women, vulnerable because they could not own property and land, etc. Whereas the lower caste women vulnerable because in the fact that they were not honorable women supposedly and good women supposedly and they were public women, their sexual life was also exploited, their sexuality was also exploited. Just to give an example of how caste kind of maintains, caste norms goes a long way to maintain property. I'll give you an example of Kerala Taravads, okay? Now, Taravads are places like, it's like a family homes, okay? It's like landed property, a lot of land attached. It's like estates. If you look at in Europe, estates. There is a family which owns land. They are the landlords. They have a lot. They have the economy in their control, and etc. So they were the upper Nambudiri Brahmins and other Nayar Taravads had a relation with each other in sense that Nambudiri Brahmins were the highest Brahmins or the Brahmins in Kerala. Interestingly, their marriage system was not endogamous. Their marriage system was exogamous. And not I mean in the sense like it's very complicated. Okay, you can ask me if you're not getting the trend. Nambudiri Brahmins, and there's another community called Nayars in Kerala. Nambudiri Brahmins owned property, Nayars also owned property. But Nambudiri Brahmins were the highest in hierarchy in terms of ritual, wealth, etc. etc. Now, the caste rule in Kerala would say that Nambudiri Brahmin children, sons of the sons, male lineage of Nambudiri Brahmins, only the first son, the eldest son, can marry a Nambudiri woman. Other sons of Nambudiri Brahmins would marry not Nambudiri women but Nayar women. They would not marry, but they would be visiting husbands to Nayar women. So there was Nayar Taravads and Nambudiri families. So Nambudiri men would marry the first son would marry a Nambudiri woman, and their children will kind of be the owners of the property and household and everything. And here the lineage is maintained in the pure line of Nambudiri Brahmins. The other sons would not be allowed to marry Nambudiri women, but they will have relationships, sexual liaisons, and kind of a marriage, okay, in with the Nayar women, and the children produced through these liaisons would become Nayar children and not Nambudiri children. Now, it is interesting because, in a very subtle way, the economy, the wealth and property being broken down is prevented through this arrangement. So, what happens is that this Nambudiri men, the second, third, fourth sons, would have relationship with Nayar women. They will be visiting husbands. They would largely stay in their own houses, maintained by their houses, the property, part of the property of those houses, have access to those properties, etc., and will be maintained by them. But the children who are produced in the Nayar families will be maintained, kept, and become Nayar children. And this is how caste norms have an integral relationship. This is an example of how caste norms have an integral relationship with maintenance of economics and property within caste. This is just one example. You can always draw more examples from your own books. If you want to read more on Nambudiri Brahmins and Nayar families, you can read this book called There Comes Papa. It's a very, very interesting book of how this caste and gender intersects with each other and how caste is maintained. If you want to understand endogamy and how endogamy matters today in building social capital, cultural capital, and economic capital, you can read this book called Time Pass. Is based on two universities in UP. And the book is about many more things, but one of the interesting thing that comes out of this book is that how when men, upper caste men who have lands back in villages, when their children, sons especially, go to universities to study or colleges to study, and then don't necessarily get jobs and are waiting for jobs, one of the strategies of getting them jobs, one of the strategies of building the economics and social capital is to marry their sisters or the daughters of the family into government and other kinds of rich families, etc., so that the network for the son also gets built. Like, for example, if I am waiting for a job as a man of the family or son of the family, and I know that social networks matters in getting jobs, what I do is that I will look for because I have land and property, otherwise I will look for families whereby for a sister, for my sister who can marry an engineer or a doctor or an administrative officer or something, someone in high office, so that my network, my access to those networks which gives jobs becomes much more. Here, endogamy plays a big role, and I'll come to it in much more elaboration when I'm coming to post-colonial India. Okay, but I'm just giving this example that if you want to read, you can read Time Pass. This book is very interesting in terms of how caste prevails within university spaces and in educational spaces. It's based on UP. So, any questions, anything that you want to ask? Because now I will wrap up the idea that economics of caste has an integral relationship to rituals of caste and norms of caste, etc. Therefore, characteristics of caste are not just ritualistic in nature, religious in nature, cultural in nature, but economic in nature also. Any questions? Any questions, any comments, anything that you want to say? If I ask you to write two paragraphs on the idea of caste, characteristics of caste, and how it is, how the political economy. Listen to my question carefully. If I give you a question today, tomorrow, write for half an hour or write 2 pages on the political economy of caste and how characteristics of caste is a reflection of political economy of caste. Can you write? Are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, okay. So now start thinking through this. How is the political economy of caste? What is the political economy of caste? How characteristics of caste is a reflection of economics of caste and not just rituals of caste? Think on those lines, okay? So maybe one of the questions to you will be in your exams will be related to this only. So start thinking and framing your answers from now on. So if you have nothing to say, no question to ask, all in agreement, everything, can I give 2 or 3 statements and you can all which you tell me if you agree with this or not? Okay, Manaswin is asking something. Okay. When upper caste women and lower caste men marry each other, then how is the upper caste economy transferred? This is not showing on. Okay, sorry. Sorry, the question is when upper caste women and lower caste men marry each other, then how is the upper caste economy transferred to lower caste men? I mean, here men will be working, so wealth will be coming from lower caste men and remain same. Okay, as women don't own any. See, the thing is that the question is not about one individual woman marrying an individual man. Okay, the question is if endogamy is not a role, if lower upper caste women started marrying lower caste men in general, okay, and what will happen is and women also start kind of owning properties, etc., or the children also have a right to property, then the maintenance of caste cannot be done in terms of wealth. Why? Because caste norms is not just about upper caste men owning wealth, but also kind of not letting the upper caste women own wealth. Okay. Now, if endogamy is removed and lower caste men start getting into your families, accepted by your families, live within your families, the children live with your families, etc., and they have a say in your life, wouldn't it lead to questioning? Wouldn't it lead to kind of some kind of resistance in politics? And within that, there may be changes in terms of wealth and property also. Especially the fact that property and caste norms are interrelated with each other. In that sense, what happens is that, and because the different regions also had different kinds of rule. That is why I gave the example of how a upper caste man marrying a lower caste women, their children are given more hierarchically high status than a lower. So it's not necessarily that if endogamy is not there, then there will be no discrimination. What will happen is that lower caste men will also start becoming part of your families. Their children will become part of your families. where will you place their children? And the more threat is that when an upper caste man marries a lower caste woman. So yes, I understand what you are asking, that the man is earning and therefore the wealth will be his, and therefore the upper caste wealth will not go. But you are imagining a place where endogamy is removed but caste property norms are not. But once endogamy is removed, it is integrally tied to property norms. And so women may start asking questions because they are now exposed to, and men of lower caste may ask also property rights within that. So, there will be a lot more disturbances, that lot more questioning within the thing, and therefore also kind of, it was necessary for upper caste women not to marry lower caste. Okay. And if the upper caste women started marrying lower caste, went out to work, okay, and kind of became empowered, wouldn't they influence their own caste members? If endogamy is not there, I'm taking everything into account. If endogamy is not a strict rule in caste, because upper caste women will see other ways of life, because upper caste women will know that they can also do things that the men that they have been told that they don't have the ability to do. So in so many ways caste will be challenged in that sense, and therefore also endogamy was a necessity, along with the really strong. When I'm saying that caste is about economics and not just ritual, I mean ritual is also very important. I'm not saying that ritual is not important. Imagine the knowledge systems that upper caste women cultivate within their caste and within their families, and marry lower caste women, lower caste men, and take their knowledge systems to them and then give pass it on to their children. Will that also not kind of become a matter of problematic matter for upper caste groups? See, all these characteristics work together. They don't work independent of each other. So, in that sense, endogamy works in connection with purity and pollution. Endogamy is not operating outside purity and pollution. It, occupation, fixed occupation is operating within endogamy, within purity and pollution, and is not operating outside. That means fixed occupation is a must to follow, and endogamy is a must to follow. The moment you keep fixed occupation as a must and endogamy as not a must, there will be problem, because skills and abilities and everything will be questioned, that has been told to you culturally that you are not supposed to do it in some ways. What is your second question? As women don't know, is it just a matter of pride? No, it is not just a matter of pride. It opens up spaces of questioning and resistance and new knowledges, as well as purity of line, okay? As well as the fact that you will give lower caste men access to your families if endogamy is not there. Therefore, hypogamy and hypergamy are different also within that, because yes, we accept lower caste women coming into our fold more openly than our women going into lower caste fold. It's also definitely what you are saying, a matter of pride, because how can a lower caste woman dare to take our women? It's definitely a matter of pride, but it is also a matter of economics. It is also a matter of opening up your spaces to other caste which you have so strongly kind of guarded, and which guarding of which only leads to protection of your privileges and property. Any other questions? If you have any other questions, ask. Otherwise, I just want to summarize this before I leave you, because this is very important to the next phase of what we are discussing. So after all these discussions, am I right to say, okay, am I right to say that, you know, okay, I'll come back to you, Manaswini. I just want to frame this before leaving people, and then I will come, leaving the class, and then I'll come to you. So, am I right to say, or am I correct if I am saying that characteristics, caste as a system ensures that social, cultural, economic, and political power remains within the ritually higher caste and doesn't remain within the ritually lower caste? Am I correct to say in a traditional system, not interfered by colonial system of new economy and new education. Within that system, class and caste were integral to each other and were not independent to each other. Am I right to say, this is my third one, that wealth and property and education and economy lay in the hands of the upper caste because of the norms and characteristics of caste, values of caste, etc. And it was not independent of caste norms, etc. So my major contention here is that if you have understood, or if you have understood that caste and class overlapped each other, were one with each other in all ways within a traditional caste system, then my work is done in terms of characteristics of caste, because this is what will matter in the next phase. The fact that social, cultural, economic, political power remained in the hands of the upper caste in a traditional caste system. This is what I want to leave you with in terms of understanding pre-colonial caste system and caste characteristics of caste. Do you agree with me? Yes, Sitiksha, I think class was maintained through caste. Yes, class was maintained through caste. That's you're right. So I hope you all of you understand how different forms of capitals remained with the upper caste. Not just it remained with the upper caste, but that was denied to the lower caste. And with my question that I'm going to leave you with, does this have an impact when new economy and new education comes in? Does characteristics of caste continue to see that social, cultural, economic, educational capital remained with the upper caste, even with colonizers coming in, and the lower caste remained deprived of it in a large way? I'll deal with that in the next way. So, is there a continuity of caste in the colonial times? Is my next lecture will be on tomorrow's lecture will be on that. You can have any questions, any doubts, any kind of contradictions or anything, you can always write to me. Manaswini, so you're saying that so not only to maintain economy, this endogamy is introduced to maintain the boundaries of. See, this is what I'm trying to say. Don't separate maintenance of boundaries of caste from maintenance of economy. They are integrally related to each other. Only when you maintain boundaries of caste can you maintain your economy. That is why endogamy becomes very, very important. That is why fixed occupation becomes important. If you don't have fixed occupation, if you don't maintain that boundary, then how will you have economy in your hand? Will it not, if you allow any caste to become teachers, any caste to become priests, any caste to become temple servers, or any caste to become engineers or whatever at that point of time, will or own lands, will they not have economy with them? So it is not only not to maintain economy, this endogamy is introduced to maintain boundaries of caste. Yes, you are right. It is to maintain economy as well as boundaries of caste, but they are not independent of each other. Maintenance of boundaries of caste is integral to maintenance of economy. Maintenance of endogamy serves the purpose of both maintaining economy as well as the purity of blood, which ritual purity of a caste. So, in that sense, it serves both the purposes. All these characteristics are interrelated to each other to kind of maintain the boundaries of caste. What kind of boundaries? Ritual boundaries as well as economic boundary. Why am I emphasizing on economic boundary? For two reasons. One is because it is always believed that caste is a cultural thing, caste is a social thing, caste is a ritual thing, and has nothing to do with economy. No, this is why I am in emphasizing on economy a lot more. Plus, I'm also emphasizing because tomorrow, when we are discussing about caste, it's class that should matter and not caste, because that is the debate of the anti reservation argument of the anti reservation groups, that why should caste be taken into account. That is where it will matter to us, that how social cultural capitals, economic capital contributes to your life chances, and therefore it is not that class is the only way marker of it, but caste continues to play a big role in economics and who can own the economy of that. That is why the importance of it. Titisha, can we say the entire purpose of caste maintenance is class? One of the major purpose of maintenance of caste was class. Okay, in that sense, they did not know class as such that time. That term was not existing in the Indian lexicon in that sense. But one knew poor and rich, and property holders and landlords, etc. Yes. So one of the major purposes of caste maintenance was class. Now, why is it very very important for us to understand and debate with the Indological approach, which is saying that the entire purpose of caste is ritual, entire purpose of caste is to maintain purity and pollution, is to argue that listen, purity and pollution is definitely important to caste. It is the major thing in caste. But if you say that purity and pollution has nothing to do with economics of caste and materiality of caste, wealth and property maintenance of caste, then you are wrong. That is where field view scholars and later Dalit scholars, subaltern scholars argued that it is a misnomer, it is a myth, it is wrong to understand caste as only a social and cultural system. It is also a very, very economically ingrained system. So yes, the major purpose of caste was to maintain purity and pollution. The major purpose of caste was also to maintain economy. And the fact is that purity and pollution is not independent of economy. Purity and pollution was also there so that economics can be maintained. So at the end of it, economy property played a major role in caste. That is what is the point of the whole argument of characteristics of caste. Any other questions? Anything? Those who have not sent me the groups, please send. Only I have received 4 groups by now. So please send your groups, otherwise I will form the groups this weekend and send it to you. Anything? Any questions? Anything?
Ma'am, about the
Namaskar.
can we form a group with 5 people?
No. This is what somebody else also asked me. Do it 4 and we will see later if someone is left out or something like that. Because then what will happen? Everybody will do 5. I don't mind, but 5 isn't it a big group that way? For the time being, make 4. Okay, for the time being, make 4. In case somebody is left out, and I will see, I will consider. But I should not be getting so many more requests like this because I've already got one and I said no. So let us stick to 4 and then we will see. Okay. Yeah. Just to follow some pattern. It's just that, nothing else. We'll see. I'll be flexible in that sense after we form the groups. Anything else? Okay. Bye then for today.
Excuse me,
Tomorrow, have a
ma'am.
good day. Yeah. Who is this?
Ma'am, this is
Yes.
Rupal.
Yeah, tell.
Ma'am, when do you have to send the name of the participants of the group?
Oh, I told you, but by tomorrow evening max or tomorrow morning, afternoon.
Tomorrow. So after tomorrow's class.
No, you can send it, but send it today also, tomorrow also. You just have to form groups. It has nothing to do with the class. Just form the group and send me my max by tomorrow.
Oh, okay, ma'am. Okay.
Yeah, tomorrow afternoon, evening, something like that. Send me in my mail, IIT mail ID.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah? Okay, yeah. Bye. Have a good day.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks. Yeah.